Welcome to our channel Elimika Mtandaoni. My name is Agustino Mogosi. In this episode, the 9th episode, we will proceed from where we ended. In the 8th episode, we introduced what we call research designs, and we explained what research designs mean. And we introduced a number of research designs in quantitative approach and qualitative approach. So today we will be explaining quantitative research designs, and we will start with the experimental design. What is experimental design? As we do what we call an experiment, what you do is you have an idea, or you have a practice or a certain procedure, and then you test it. You test that idea, you test that procedure or practice to determine whether it has influence on a certain outcome or on a certain dependent variable. What you do is first you decide on an idea, or you decide on a procedure or practice that you want to experiment. After that, you assign individuals to experience it. So you have one group that you expose it to a certain procedure, you expose it to certain practice or a certain idea. Then you have some other individuals that you allow them to experience something different. And then you determine whether those who have experienced that idea then performed better on some outcome than those who did not or are not exposed into it. For example, let me tell you, if you compare one group of students that you expose them to internet use in studying, and another group only for them to use a library for the study. But there are some important things that you should consider. You have to control all the factors that might influence the outcome of one of the two groups. Then you make sure that the personal abilities and even test conditions are equal to both of the groups. Then you give these groups the same questions, and in the end, on the results, then you come and say if those who were exposed to internet performed better than those who just given a library to study. So that is a kind of design that we call experimental design. But when do you use an experiment? It's not every time that you can use an experiment. You use an experiment when you want to establish what we call possible cause and effect between independent and dependent variable. If you want to test if independent variable influences a certain dependent variable. So if you have that kind of situation, then the best design is experimental design. After that, when the independent variable influences the dependent variable, then there you can say that an independent variable caused, or we say probably caused the dependent variable. Then simply because experiments are controlled, then these are the best designs in a quantitative approach. You have to use them if you want to establish a possible probable cause and effect. So that is the meaning of experimental design. Then we have characteristics. For your design to be called the experimental design, it has to fall under these 6 characteristics. But the first and the very most characteristic that should be seen for an experiment to be called experiment is the random assignment. As an experimental researcher, you will assign individuals to groups. As I have given you an example, you can have 2 groups. So you say one that you exposed to internet use, and another one that you allowed them to use a library. So as a researcher, you will assign individuals to groups, but the most rigorous approach is to do that assignment randomly. So the most rigorous approach is to randomly assign these individuals to treatments. So by random assignment, we mean is the process of assigning individuals at random to groups. You assign individuals to groups at random, or different groups in an experiment. So, but you should not confuse these things. is what we call random assignment and random selection. These things are both important in quantitative research, but they have a different purpose. They have different purposes. In quantitative research, random selection of a sample from a population is different from a random assignment. In random selection, in this way, a sample is a representative of a certain population, and you can generalize results obtained during the study to the population. But speaking of random assignment means you take a certain group of people, you have certain individuals, then you put them to a certain group. So that grouping of individuals should be done randomly. Another important characteristic is a control over extraneous variable. In As you are doing a random assignment of individuals, we say that we are controlling, we control what we call extraneous variables that might influence the relationship between the new practice and the outcome. Speaking of extraneous factors, these are any influences in the selection of participants. On any influences in the selection of participants. Selection of procedures, selection of statistics, or selection of designs that are likely to affect an outcome and can provide an alternative explanation for results that we expected. So you have to control all extraneous factors, for example, personal abilities in your example for internet and the library, personal abilities and other factors that might influence our outcome. Then controlling that is another characteristics. But we have another characteristic that is manipulating treatment conditions. Once you have selected participants, then you randomly assign them to either a treatment condition or to an experimental group. So you can have two groups. You have a treatment group, or we have an experimental group. In experimental treatment, what you do, the researcher then intervenes to alter conditions that are experienced by the experimental unit. So you have one group that you want to experiment, for example, the one that you have grouped into using internet. Then you do a kind of manipulations, you alter certain conditions, and to see if it brings effect or it brings an outcome. So that is another characteristic. So it is a kind of X and Y relationship where you add some values to the X value to see if it makes changes to the Y value. So that is another characteristics. Another characteristic of experiments is outcome measures. In all experimental situations, you assess whether a treatment condition influences an outcome or dependent variable. So every time you're exposed to a certain condition, then you assess, does whatever situation that I've altered, does it influence an outcome? So you have that kind of measurement, that kind of outcome measurements. So in experiments, the outcome or the response or the criterion is the dependent variable, that is presumed effect of the treatment variable. It is also the effect that is predicted in a hypothesis in a cause and effect equation. You have a cause and effect equation, then you put a cause, you alter conditions in the cause to see what will be the effects. Another characteristic, another important characteristic is group comparisons. Group comparisons. In an experiment, you also compare scores of different treatments on an outcome. So you have groups. A group comparison, we say, is a process of a researcher to obtain scores for individuals or groups on the dependent variable and compare them with the means and variances both within the group and between the groups. So you have a kind of group comparison. That is another important characteristics in experimental research. The last characteristic is a threat to validity. A fine idea in experiments is to design them so that the inferences you draw are true or they are correct. So threats to drawing correct inferences they need to be addressed in an experimental research. You have to make sure that all the threats that can hinder the drawing to draw a correct inferences, you need to address them in the research. So speaking of threats of validity, this means to a specific, it refers to specific reasons for why we can be wrong when we make an inference in an experiment because of a certain covariances or causational constructs, or whether the cause relationship holds over variations in person's settings or treatments or outcomes. So you have to make sure that all the threats are eliminated. Now we go to types of experimental designs. We have two main types of experimental designs. The first one is true experiments, and the second one is quasi experiments. Speaking of group A, and you have another group, we call it group B. So in you have your participants here. Say you have your participants in here. You have some of the participants. Let's say we have those participants. You have different participants, the blue participants and the black participants. Then you decide to randomly take this one there, and you take this one there. Randomly, you take another group, you put it there. You take another group, you put it there. Okay. You have another participant again, you put it there, and you have this other participant, you put it there. So you have participants in different group. The first group, this one here, is the one that we call let's say a control group, and you have another that we call experimental group. So you want to measure the effect of certain things in this group that we call a experimental group. There is where you will provide certain conditions. You will provide certain conditions to see if there is any effect that will occur. So, and you control this other group. So if you're talking about true experiment, this process of taking individuals to this group and this group, it should be done randomly. That is an example. It should be done randomly. Now, coming to a quasi experiment. Speaking of quasi experiments, this they include assignment, just like what we have done, but this assignment is not done randomly. It is not done randomly. After we have finished explaining about experimental design, now we move to correlational design. Correlational design provides an opportunity for you to predict scores and explain the relationship among variables. In correlational research, what you do, investigators use the correlational statistic test to describe and measure the degree of association or relationship between two or more variables. Speaking of correlation, this is just a statistical test to determine the tendency or pattern for which two or more variables or two sets of data vary consistently. In the case of only two variables, this means that two variables share a common variance, or they covary together. Covary means we can predict a score on one variable with knowledge about the individual's scores on another variable. So the statistic that expresses a correlational statistic as a linear relationship is the product moment correlation coefficient. The type of statistic that we can express correlational statistic, we express it as a linear relationship, and it is called the product moment correlational coefficient. It is also called the bivariate correlation because it deals with two variables, or another name we call it a zero order correlation, or just simply R. So let's say when do you use correlational research? As we have said that correlational research provides two important opportunities. One, to predict scores, and two, to explain the relationship among variables. So when do you use correlational research? You use correlational research when you seek to relate two or more variables to see if they influence one another. This kind of design allows you to predict an outcome. You also use this kind of design when you know and you can apply statistical knowledge based on calculating the correlational statistical test. So those important things, if you encounter those important situations, the three important situations, if you seek to relate two or more variables to see if they influence one another, or if your design allows you to predict an outcome, or if you use when you know and you can apply statistical knowledge based on calculating the correlational statistical test, then correlation research design is the best design for you. We have different types of correlational design. We have two important types. One is explanatory design. Speaking of explanatory design, we say this is a correlation design in which the researcher is interested in the extent to which two variables or more variables covary. That means where changes in one variable reflected in the changes in the another variable. So if you have x relates to y, then if you change x, then y changes. So that type of experiment, that type of design, that type of research, we call it explanatory design. That you have we have two variables. If you make change to one variable, that affects another variable. So this type of design is characterized by the following. One characteristic is that the investigator correlates two or more variables. So the investigator correlates or finds the relationship between two or more variables. Also, researchers collect data at one point in time. That means the collection of data is done in one setting, and a researcher is not interested in either past or future performance of participants. Another investigation is that the investigator, or another characteristic is that the investigator analyzes all participants as a single group. The analysis of participants is done as a single group. Then the researcher obtains at least two scores for each individual in a group, one for each variable. So you can have two scores, one for X, let's say, another one for Y. So you have at least two scores. Then the researcher reports the use of correlational statistical tests or extension of it in the data analysis. And in the end, the researcher makes interpretation or draws conclusion from the statistical test results. So you start by correlating two or more variables, then you collect the data. After collecting the data, you analyze the participants, but as a single group. Then you obtain scores of these individuals in one group. Then you report the use of correlational statistical test in that analysis. And finally, you make interpretation or you draw conclusions from such statistical tests or statistical results. Then another type, we call it prediction design. The purpose of prediction research design is to identify variables that will predict an outcome or a criterion. What investigator does, investigator identifies one or more predictor variable and an outcome variable. So you have a predictor variable and an outcome variable. Then a predictor variable is a variable that is used to make a forecast about an outcome or in a correlational research. So you have a certain variable that will be used to predict or to forecast the outcome. And then the outcome that is being predicted in a correlational research is called a criterion variable. It's called a criterion variable. So what are the characteristics of correlational prediction design? One, the authors should include the word prediction in the title. If you find that kind of a title, or in a title, or let's say in a purpose statement, a kind of title that speaks about the prediction, there is a word prediction in that title, then that kind of research or that kind of design, we call it prediction design. Then the researcher typically measure the predictor variable at one point in time and outcome variable at a later point in time. So at first, you measure a predictor variable, then you come again and measure outcome variable. You measure outcome variable. What are the key characteristics of correlation design? How will you know that these are correlation design? So the first important characteristic is display of scores. Say display of scores. Speaking of display of scores, what does it mean? Um, let's have an example here. Display of scores. For example, you are here, you have obtained your results. You have obtained your results. You have your results like this. Let me show you here. Have your results just like this. You have a table like this, and you have values for x and values for y. Then you record the values for x. Let's say this is 2, and you do your study. You find if you put 2, the values for y becomes 4. If you put 4, the values for y becomes 8. Then you come here and you plot a graph. You say if you had 2, y was 4, and if you had 4, y had 8. So you come and draw a plot. So display of scores, you display them through these plots. We call them scatter plots, and in fact these scatter plots, they do not they are not presented by lines. You just put some dots like this, like this, like that, like that. This is what we call scatter plots. But again, you can use what we call correlational matrix. You can use correlational matrix. So that is one important characteristic of a correlational designs. That is one characteristic of correlational design. Another characteristics is association between scores. Association between scores. In association between scores, you look at things like direction of association. You look things at direction of the association, the form of association, the linear relationship, and the degree and the strength of association. I will also show you this. I will also show you this. Let me show you this in the drawing here. Let me show you this here. Yeah. Suppose, speaking of direction of association, you have your plot. You have your plot like this. Direction of association can be a positive correlation. That means it goes this way, or it can be a negative correlation. This is negative, and this is a positive correlation. Yeah? You can express it in form of that. Speaking of form of correlation, is you can have either a linear association, or you can have a non-linear association. You can have linear association, or you can have a non-linear association. And speaking of degree and strength of association. Degree and strength of association, that means association between two variables. Association between two variables or sets of scores is a correlational coefficient that is from -1 to +1. So if it increases in this way, then we say this one is more strength. It has much strength as compared to this that moves to the negative direction. So those are the characteristics of correlational design. Now we move to another type of research design, quantitative research design. We call it survey designs. Survey designs are procedures in quantitative research in which investigators administer a survey. to a sample or to the entire population of people to describe the following, to describe their attitudes, to describe their opinions, behaviors, or characteristics. In this procedure, survey researchers, what they do, they collect quantitative or numbered data using either questionnaires or using interviews, and in the end they do a statistical analysis of such data to describe trends about responses to questions and to test the research questions or the hypotheses. And in the end, they interpret the meaning of the data by relating results of the statistical test back to the past research studies. So in survey, what they do is you have a population, or you have a sample of a population, then you administer questionnaires, or you administer interviews, then you collect numbered data or quantitative data. After you have collected the quantitative data, then you do a kind of analysis with the aim of describing either trends about those responses, their responses to what? Responses to the questions, and then you test the hypothesis, or you test the research questions that you have identified in the beginning of your study. Now, what are the types of survey designs? Or when do we use survey design? Before going to the types, let's say, when do you use survey designs? You use survey research design to describe trends, as I've said, to describe trends. But also you use survey research designs to determine the opinions of individuals about certain issues, the opinions, and you represent the results in form of analyzed numbers. Then what are the types of survey designs? We have two important types. One is cross-sectional survey, and two, we have longitudinal survey. Then, speaking of cross-sectional survey, here researcher collects data at one point in time. Just at one point in time, you go and collect your data, then you come, you analyze the data, then you represent the results in form of tables, in terms of figures, or in terms of explanation. Then you have longitudinal survey. This kind of survey, the collection of data about trends with the same population, or changes in cohort group or subpopulation, or changes in a panel group of the same individual, it is done over a time. There is a kind of follow-up, which is different from cross-sectional, where a collection of data is done at one point of time. But with the longitudinal survey, there is a kind of follow-up. What are the characteristics of survey design? There is what we call sampling. You do first sampling from a population. After you have taken your sample, then you collect data from that sample using questionnaire or interviews, and the data that you collect should be numbered data. Then from there, you design instruments for data collection. You do a design of data collection instruments, for example, a questionnaire or an interview, in the aim of collecting quantitative data. Then you obtain a high response rate. Thank you very much. You have been following us with this episode of research process, and now we are in the 9th episode that we have explained the quantitative research designs, and in the next episode we will describe the qualitative research design. Thank you very much for following us. Don't forget to subscribe. My name is Agustino Mogos. Ciao.